I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathering here tonight on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I recognise that this has always been a place for the discussion of big ideas, that these lands were stolen and that sovereignty was never ceded. The ongoing impact of settler colonialism is certainly something to be mad about. And so who better to discuss the politically transformative power of anger than our guest tonight, Rebecca Traister. Now, before I introduce you to Rebecca, I'll just quickly let you know that I'm Claire Wright, and I'm a feminist historian, author and broadcaster, and an associate professor of history at La Trobe University. I'm also very proud to be a board director at the Wheeler Centre, and with that hat on, can I sneakily suggest that if you like what the Wheeler Centre does, you might consider joining its hugely entertaining e-newsletter, or perhaps even making a donation via the website and becoming or you could become one of the Wheeler Centre's wonderful patrons and sponsors. You might not know that 80% of the Wheeler Centre's events are free, and the Wheeler Centre puts on 275 odd events a year, and it's the generosity of the thinking public like you that makes that possible. Okay, so now to the reason you've torn yourself all away from what remains of the Easter eggs and come out here tonight to hear Rebecca Traister get good and mad. Rebecca is a New York Times best-selling author and feminist journalist whose reportage of politics, popular culture and the media in America has been widely published, including in Salon, The Washington Post and The New Republic. She has been described in The New Yorker as a feminist first responder, reporting from the front line of sexism in America. Rebecca is currently writer-at-large for New York Magazine. You might explain what a writer-at-large does later, and a contributing editor at Elle. And she's the author of All the Single Ladies and Big Girls Don't Cry, based on Rebecca's coverage of the 2008 presidential campaign and its impact on American politics, women and feminism. Rebecca lives in New York City when she arrived only yesterday to discuss her latest book, Good and Mad, The Revolutionary Power of Women's Anger. And this is Rebecca's first trip to Australia, so let's give her a big, warm, jet-lag relieving welcome.
Thank you.
Rebecca, congratulations. Good and Mad is a great blaze of a book. I read it in pretty much one all-consuming incendiary session. And I know you should never judge a book by its cover, but I'd actually like to start our conversation by focusing on your sensational end papers. And I've forgotten to bring my prop, which is your book, to show you the end papers that you wouldn't be able to see anyway from out there in the audience. But when you buy your copy of the book later, you'll be able to see them. It's a riotous collage of protest signs and placards. And some of the more eye-catching ones go like this. My outrage does not fit on this sign. Feminism is my favourite F word. I am woman, pay me more. Your guns have more rights than my vagina. If I call it an assault uterus, will you stop trying to regulate it? When they go low, we vote them out. And my personal favourite, fuck you, you fucking fuck. So, Rebecca, these are all signs from the Women's March in Washington, DC on the 17th of January 2017. So tell us why that day and that event is the starting point for your book.
Well, I should clarify that they're not all from that day. They were collected over the period of the couple of years that I was writing the book. The Women's March in its first, and by the way, thank you, Claire. Thank you to the Wheeler Center. Thank you to all of you who are here tonight. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm so thrilled to be making my first visit to Australia and to Melbourne. Thank you so much for having me. So the Women's March was crucial and catalytic for reasons that I think extend beyond the way we sort of absorb it as that, oh, this thing, the Women's March, the Women's March, the Women's March organization, which there's been a lot of press about since, because it's been, its leaders have been embroiled in all kinds of arguments and anger about racism and anti-Semitism. And the thing that was crucial, though, about that march that I think was missed was that it was born out of fractiousness. It was born in conflict and born of anger, not just anger at Donald Trump, anger between allies, anger within a progressive coalition. It was born after a calamitous event, the election of Donald Trump, happened in part because there hadn't been enough anger in advance of his election. It was difficult and corrective and explosive. And the thing that that event did, well beyond its organization and well beyond, there was another one, there was a second Women's March, there was a third Women's March this year, neither of them were as big as the first one, that's fine. What that first Women's March did was radically alter the tenor of a political conversation in the United States and around the world, because of course the Women's March was here too. The Women's March was in 600 places around the world. The Women's March was a moment at which people who were livid, furious, at injustice, at inequality, at the far right, and often at each other, came out and marched and yelled and made the statement that they were going to become visible and audible to each other and to those that they wanted to challenge. And it happened on a scale that no one expected, that nobody in power, no one in the media, no one in politics actually expected it to come together. I remember conversations I had 2 days before with people saying, oh, but it's such a mess and people are all angry and they're grumpy with each other. Who's going to come out? And everybody I knew, well, not everybody, but it was massive. And I think that it just made this statement that we're not going to go down passively, that there is an undercurrent of fury, and it's maybe aimed in a million different directions, but it can be used in this moment to come together to the same space, to talk to each other, and to make our fury visible. And what happened out of it was that people met each other. They realized they weren't alone, which is incredibly crucial to beginning the work of organizing and coalition building that has to happen if we're going to build the kinds of political and social movements that can, in fact, react to and challenge not just a Donald Trump administration, but we know the global push toward right-wing, white, patriarchal authoritarianism that is happening around the world. And the Women's March was this event at which people met each other. The way that what happened in the wake of that meeting and that moment of visibility and screaming and yelling and acknowledgement that this was these feelings of fury were shared, were the beginnings, building block relationships, people who would go on to dedicate the next 2 years of their lives to organizing around state and local elections. Those who, in seeing the power of being in this crowd, started getting interested in the labor movement. There's been a resurgence in the United States of labor actions, teacher strikes in states where striking is illegal. There have been teacher strikes, fast food worker strikes. Lots of the people who've participated in and organized those strikes said, well, in part, I got the idea from the Women's March. It brought back the idea of mass, visible, public protest and the act of walking out. I think the Women's March was part of what undergirded what would become the hashtag #MeToo movement in the fall of 2017. Again, this sense of, I'm not alone in this, and I'm going to say it out loud, and I'm going to make my story heard, and I'm going to listen to the stories of others. So that, in part, is why that day is important, but it's not that. I think it's also used, it's funny, the Women's March, in advance it wasn't taken seriously enough. In its wake, it wasn't taken seriously enough. I write in the book of how undercovered it was. It was the single biggest day, the biggest single day political protest in the history of the United States of America. And when I went back and watched, in the United States, we have these Sunday shows, which are the news shows, the wrap-ups, that are kind of, they take the temperature of like what the political media takes seriously that week. What's the big story? And I went and I watched the Sunday shows from literally the day after the Women's March, which again had been a global phenomenon, had shut down cities across the United States, not just Washington and New York and Los Angeles and Chicago, but Austin and Anchorage and Portland, Maine. And when I went and watched the Sunday shows, the male hosts, George Stephanopoulos, he's a network host, he had Kellyanne Conway, President Trump's advisor, on for 15 minutes, and he didn't ask her a single question about the Women's March. She brought it up twice. He didn't want to talk about it. The news media didn't want to talk about it, even in the wake of this massive. Can you imagine the biggest political demonstration in the country's history, and your news host, the day after the inauguration of the new president, and the news hosts don't even really want to mention it or take it seriously? There was a male senator who came on one of those programs and said, well, yesterday I was at the Women's March, and the host said, were you comfortable with everything you heard there? Truly, as if the comfort, it was Chuck Schumer, who's the Democratic minority leader in the Senate, as if the question of whether Chuck Schumer had been comfortable at the Women's March was the pressing question to be asked. And so it wasn't taken seriously. Everybody assumed it was going to, backfire spectacularly in advance. Then it happened. It's the biggest single-day protest in the country's history. There's not an appetite to really consider what it might mean. And I go through all of the minimizing things people said about it. Now, 2 years later, because the fractiousness out of which it was born has not dissipated, and as I mentioned, there's been all kinds of controversy around the Women's March co-chairs and everything. This media that didn't want to take it seriously as a sign and outpouring of the vivid, livid fury and energy of all those millions of people who were there, now wants to use it as a measuring stick to say, oh, well, it was a smaller Women's March this year, so clearly that's faded and gone away. And it was like, wait, assholes. When this thing was massive, the most massive political demonstration you've ever seen, you didn't want to talk about it on your Sunday shows, but now you want to talk about how the energy behind the women's movement is fading? Fuck you, you fucking fucks. Which was, by the way, there was a brief and halcyon period where I pushed for that to be the title of my book.
Was that your placard that you secretly snuck in there?
It was not, but it is my favorite.
We'll talk about some of those diminishing tactics a little bit later, but just sticking with the Women's March for the moment, you described what happened that day as an awakening. Mm-hmm. And what really interested me about that language is it's the very same language and imagery that waking the sleeping giant of women's consciousness of their own oppression that the suffrage movement used a century earlier. The women's awakening, the new dawn. How is it that women are continually lulled back to sleep, generation after generation, until their wrath is awoken, not by the prince's kiss, but by some poisonous prick? Prick to the finger.
Well, I think that we can't get to the answer to that question until we acknowledge who's sleeping. It's white middle-class women. Mm-hmm. And they are lulled back to sleep thanks to their whiteness, their proximity to power, and the fact that they are middle class and can reach economic stability and tell themselves that things have been fixed. Because to some degree, there's the impression that they've been fixed in their favor. And to some very real degree, lots of things do work in their favor, my favor. And over again, I mean, this is, if you look at a white capitalist patriarchal power structure, how it's fundamentally a case of minority rule, right? And, it's one small segment of the population that is afforded a tremendous grip on economic, political, social, professional power, sexual power. And that small segment of the population holds sway over a majority and subjugates that majority. Well, in a theoretical democracy, and in the United States it is not a direct democracy. We have a president right now who lost a popular vote by more than 3 million. But in a theoretical representational democracy, how does a minority power stay in power if theoretically the majority could unite and topple it? Well, white capitalist patriarchy works in part by extending kinds of privileges to segments of that majority, to persuade them to defend it, to persuade them that it's in their interest to defend, support, and thus benefit from and participate in that white capitalist patriarchy. So to men across races are extended the benefits of patriarchy, and to white women is extended the benefits of white supremacy. And that is an enticement that works, and the promise that they'll be protected within patriarchy, right? And there are a lot of people who believe that, who are very invested in believing it. Because power, because money is so unevenly distributed, there's also the dynamic that women are very often quite literally dependent on men. And white women are very often dependent on white men for economic reasons, through marriage, as their bosses, as the people who have all kinds of economic and professional and intimate sexual, romantic power, social power. And when there are these big movements, and then the backlashes to them, and part of a backlash is always to say, okay, all right, you did it, you extracted all of this stuff from power, now your life is set, now it's silly if you're still angry about anything. And that's a huge part of that silencing message that's sent, is you look silly if you're angry. You're overdramatic, you're being not just hysterical, but sort of needlessly performative in your fury, right? Because you got everything. Those messages are specifically and especially directed at privileged white women who have a lot of power. And so quelling their fury is really important for a white patriarchal power structure. And it works. And white women do benefit from any number of these systemic changes that are made when social movements extract new rights, liberties, and protections. And so part of what had happened in the wake of the second wave feminist movement in the United States is that white middle-class women had been lulled back to sleep and tricked by the story that we like to tell ourselves in the United States, which is that we are post-race, post-gender, post-feminist. We've fixed the problems, the horrors on which the nation was built, around which it was built, and things are great now. And there were all kinds of things that this was also true around the election of Barack Obama, where the United States, I am here to tell you that the United States told itself a story that racism was fixed because we elected a black president. And lots of people want to buy into that lie. And if you are living a fundamentally comfortable life in a lot of ways, and of course many of the opportunities won during feminism's second wave, and feminism's second wave itself is built in part on the activism, thinking, and scholarship of women of color, and then white middle-class women were awakened then and came in and co-opted a lot of the thinking and the work done, in many cases, by women of color, and won entrance into, in greater numbers, into universities and new professions and new kinds of workplace protections, reproductive rights and birth control. But a lot of those wins most directly benefited white middle-class women, who were the people who most benefited from affirmative action plans, getting into colleges and getting new kinds of jobs. It was white middle-class women's reproductive rights that were actually protected in the United States, where basically as soon as abortion was legalized, just a couple of years later, a legislative rider was passed that prevented government insurance programs for paying for abortion. So poor women and many women of color, poor women of color, were barred from getting abortion. It became unavailable to non-middle class populations almost as soon as abortion became legal. And so, but there were all kinds of things where if you were a white middle class woman in the United States, in fact, you were benefiting from so many of the changes. And there was this sort of sense that things were fixed. And one of the things that has happened over the past couple of years is that a lot of the losses that provoked this awakening were the visible losses of white middle-class women, women who had won at white patriarchy, who'd gotten as far up as you can get in the system. It is not an accident that Hillary Clinton's loss, it's not that Hillary Clinton drew the support of white women. She didn't. The majority of them, according to exit polls, voted for Donald Trump, as white women have historically always voted for conservative candidates in the United States, the majority. But when she lost, there was something about that. Here was a woman who had won everything within a patriarchal political system. She had gotten to the top. She was the establishment candidate. So much so that the fact that she was a woman and that there had been no woman ever as a major party candidate in the United States had almost become invisible, indiscernible about her, right? There was nothing revolutionary about Hillary Clinton in the popular narrative because she had so firmly established herself. She was the top of this system. And yet she could be beaten by a racist and incompetent toddler. And that mirrors the daily experiences, right? That's like, I don't know if you know the movie 9 to 5, the Dolly, right? This is like the Dabney Coleman, the sexist, lying, hypocritical bigot, right? Can still get your job even if you've been prepared to take it for the past 20 years. This mirrored something that was familiar for a lot of people. When the hashtag Me Too movement started in the fall of 2017, it is notable, first of all, Tarana Burke had pioneered, had invented, had led Me Too a decade before, aimed specifically, that conversation was about sexual violence in communities of color. And it had stayed at the margins to some extent. It had been incredibly powerful on those margins, but it wasn't taken up by Hollywood and in Twitter campaigns and on the front pages of newspapers. But when women came forward very bravely to tell the stories of Harvey Weinstein raping them, assaulting them, harassing them, it was wealthy white actresses. And it was like a view of the limits. Okay, so you can have one, you're a beautiful, well-compensated actress in Hollywood, and your career can still be derailed and you can still be physically violated and assaulted and harmed by this powerful man who holds your career in his hand. That was a view of the limits of the power available to even the most successful white woman within this system. And then, of course, much more recently, Christine Blasey Ford, who testified that she'd been assaulted by Brett Kavanaugh when they were in high school. Here was a white, married, middle-class woman who came from the same elite circles as Kavanaugh. And what was put on view was the limit to which, terrific, so the message to white middle-class women is you'll be taken care of, you'll be protected. Well, no, you fucking won't when it comes down to it if you challenge the powerful. And that's part of what has awakened this particular group. And it is, I regret to say, that in part, and it's problematic, right? Because so the white women get awakened and then we say, oh, now we're having a political movement. And it's in part because of the very power they have, the proximity and the access to the money, the media, the politics, where when they get awakened, they can make an impact. And that is the story of the second wave. To some extent, it's the story of a suffrage movement, although that's obviously stretched over so much longer.
So, Rebecca, one of the things that I really liked about your book, I loved this about your book, and which makes it so different from the usual crop of long-form journalism, is your observation and your acknowledgement of history. And you suggest that one of the other reasons that women are lulled back to sleep, that part of the lullaby is a kind of historical amnesia. And that isn't a forgetfulness, it's actually by design, that women aren't taught their history. But for you, the history of women as political activists in America becomes central not just to your research for this book, but to your overall thesis that women's anger has actually shaped America. So why your interest in giving credit where historical credit is due?
I think that those, as you are saying, that the stories we're not taught on purpose. There is a strategy behind both the sort of discouragement of the expression of anger, women's anger, and the anger of marginalized people. That it's discouraged. But one of the ways in which it's discouraged is not just the messages that you sound crazy, it's going to undermine your message, you sound hysterical, over-emotional, infantile, we're not going to take you seriously, right? It's also in the way that we are taught our own history. So I am not a historian, and I'm acutely aware of that. You know, I'm not an academic. I come from a family of English professors. I know very well what it means to be an actual scholar and an actual historian, and I am not that. I am somebody who, as a journalist, became very curious about how we got to this point in the story, because I thought it could help me think about the factors in play and think about what might happen moving forward. And so I sort of have a lot of the history that's in my books is history I myself have very recently learned in my adulthood. And I had a very expensive education in the United States, and I was not taught any of this history. And the more of the history that I learned, the crazier it seemed to me that it was not history that we had been taught. So why weren't we taught it? Why are we not taught? In the United States, for example, we are taught a history of the labor movement that is about coal miners, air traffic controllers, men, the romantic movies about unionizing. These are men out there. The truth is that the history of labor in the United States is very much women's history. Some of the first walkouts in the country's history were in the 1830s in the Lowell textile mills in New England. Young girls who staffed these textile mills were furious about their working conditions. They formed one of the first labor unions. It was black washerwomen in Atlanta who went out on strike in 1881, just a few years after emancipation, and brought the entire city's economy to a halt because they struck. It was in the early 20th century the garment workers, women, Clara Lemlich in New York City, who called for the walkout of 20,000 shirtwaist manufacturers, the shirts that they were making for the shop girls in New York City. Dangerous working conditions, and they extracted new, safer working condition agreements with almost every one of the shirtwaist manufacturers except the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which then had a horrible fire and 146 people were killed. That was in 1911. And yet that history of unionizing was not history I was ever taught. I was never taught, we're taught about political anger as a good and righteous thing only if it's coming in the United States from the founding fathers, the people who poured tea in the harbor as part of the American Revolution and who said, give me liberty or give me death and live free or die. And the only story of a woman we're told is Betsy Ross, the probably apocryphal figure who made the flag, and Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams. And I was only ever taught that she said this one feminist thing, which was, remember the ladies, in a letter that she wrote to her husband as he was building the new nation. And it was quite deep into my adulthood. I mean, this was not so recently, but it was certainly in my 20s at least that I actually really sat down with her letters and realized that in the same letter where she'd said, remember the ladies, John, she had also said, same letter, it's not like they lost it. She said, remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. And she used the word tyrant, which is the language of revolution that her husband and his compatriots were using about King George, tyranny. She was, and it also sounds like something somebody could write on Twitter, like today, right? Like, remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. And then again in the same letter, she says, if you don't include the women in your plans, as you're building this new nation, we are determined to foment a rebellion. She's using the language of rebellion. We are never taught this by the same people who are like stuffing remember the ladies down our throats. Remember the ladies is a fucking low bar request. All men would be tyrants. That's and using the language of tyranny and rebellion toward your husband as he is building a new nation. That's anger. But it's never transmitted to us. When we are taught about Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat in 1955, we are taught the story of Rosa Parks as catalytic to the civil rights movement. I was taught that. I was taught that she was a seamstress, that she was exhausted. Those things are true. She was livid. And I was never taught that. I was never taught about how anger played into her entire life as an organizer, that keeping her seat on that bus was an aggressive, intentional political act that she worked as a investigator for the NAACP, investigating the gang rapes of black women in the Jim Crow South by white men, and the often false claims of sexual assault made by white women against black men to justify lynching and racial violence. That was what Rosa Parks dedicated her life to doing. I was never taught that part of the story. So why aren't we taught about women's anger as politically potent and nation-shaping? Because it has been nation-shaping, not just in the United States, around the world. And we kind of know that, but many of us don't have the stories. We kind of know it, right? But if we're not given the stories of how it happened, and we're not taught that that's part of how our laws were made and fixed and reshaped, then how do we know that the anger that we feel isn't just something that, makes us crazy and hysterical, but could be part of any number of movements to transform and make better the world in which we live, and to challenge the things we're angry about? We're not taught that on purpose so that we don't know that that's true.
Rebecca, I was going to raise the Rosa Parks, so I'm glad you did, because I thought that was a really fascinating insight about the way that you're taught about that particular aspect of American history. Now, your book is almost exclusively focused on American politics and history, that's what you know. So I'm asking you to push beyond, in a way, your comfort zone. Do you think that your thesis that women's rage has been central to America's growth as a nation applies more universally? Or are women less likely to get angry in nations like Australia that have historically had social safety nets and high wages and more equitable health and welfare provisions? Or is women's anger germane? Is it primordial? Is it evolutionary even?
That's a fascinating question. I think that there are so many different things to be angry about. So I know, and a lot of women's anger, I should also point out, isn't just about gendered inequity. A lot of what I'm writing in this book is about economic inequality, about racial violence and injustice. And so, yes, we know that there's anger globally that is felt and expressed and acted on by women in all of those directions. But it is also true that while I wish we had the social safety nets that you had, I also suspect that sexism has not been eradicated here in Australia. and Julie Gillard's, 2012? Is it 2012 that Julie Gillard
You're pointing
gave
to the misogyny speech?
The misogyny speech.
Yes.
So I also hear that there's misogyny here in Australian government. Yeah, I think women's anger is global. It takes different forms in response to the different structures that they're responding to. And as I said, it's not all about gender. The gender is so tied up. I mean, I think so, and I know you're in the midst of an election cycle, which is like, as is happening in the United States, being centered around issues of immigration and questions about how to bring in or keep out refugees. Well, so much of that is also about gender and reproduction and controlling populations in ways that we don't often make clear. That's certainly true in the United States. So much of and this is, I know, not true here any longer. So much of what we talk about in the United States around gun violence is also tied to misogyny. So yes, it is. Among the things we're angry about in the United States are the lack of the social safety net and the sort of general policy support. In the United States, we don't even have guaranteed maternity coverage. This is one of the top embarrassing things about the country, and there are so many embarrassing things, but it's really up there. We don't have those basic things, so that's a good part of what we're angry about. But I suspect and sort of know that in fact there's plenty to be angry about, even when you have good family leave policies.
So if anger is germane, and feminists have been dealing with their anger in one way or another, women have been dealing with their anger for centuries, I was fascinated to read what Gloria Steinem told you about her own anger and how hard she found it to recognise her emotions in real time. Even someone as practised at rhetoric and at argument as Gloria Steinem. Even at the height of her feminist power, she confessed to you, "I could finally tell people on a Thursday that I'd been angry on Monday." So what is that? Why is our anger so deeply buried, not just in our historical amnesia, but in our own personal identity as women?
Because we're taught to feel shame about it. We're taught that it is an unnatural emotion. We are not taught as men, and as white men in particular, are taught that anger is a perfectly rational and valid response to all kinds of circumstances in life. That is, there's a way in which, more broadly, I think white men are permitted full humanity. So and women are kept from various aspects of the full human experience, and the discouragement of the expression of anger is so intense that we are also made to feel bad or as though there's something wrong with us if we are feeling it. Like, I'm an angry person, I must be ugly or unhinged, or my anger must not be real or serious. Look, they're not even taking it seriously when 5 million of us showed up on a Saturday. They won't even acknowledge it on Sunday morning. How could we not feel self-conscious about the anger that we feel? And of course, because the expression is not encouraged or accepted as valid or just part of the human range of emotions, when it's bottled up, it then becomes more intense and eats away at us. I've heard from so many people since I've published this book. Another thing I write about that reminds me of Gloria's line about having grown up not even recognizing that she was angry, is the fact that I write in the book about how when women cry, and it's understood, it's one of the sort of expressions of anger that's permitted because crying makes us appear vulnerable, and that's cool, especially for white women in particular. But so many women have said to me, "Oh my God, I'd never realized that when I cried it was because I was furious." Because in fact we're taught, well, the crying means, oh, you're feeling sad, you're tired, right? But in fact, not all, but a huge percentage of my experiences crying, and especially crying at work, are because I am aflame with rage, right? And if I were to let the rage out, it would be like throwing staplers through windows. And so I can't do that. So all I can do, I can't yell at the boss or my colleague or whatever, so you cry. And the crying is this outlet. And so many people are like, "Oh my God, that's exactly right. Of course I'm angry when I cry." But I've never even permitted myself to realize that. And that's one of the most common reactions I've gotten in the months that this book has been out, is women telling me like, "Oh my God, I didn't know, but you're exactly right. I'm so angry when I cry." We are discouraged from looking at our own anger. I will tell you the sort of origin story of how I came to write this book. I have obviously been angry. I wouldn't be a feminist journalist if I weren't angry. It underscores my work. If you write about gendered and racial and economic inequality, you have to be angry to do that kind of work. But I write about this in the book, I took great pains I knew leading with anger would turn people off, because I had just grown up soaked. That's how the second waivers had been diminished in my mind. I was born in 1975, and it was like, oh, they were just a bunch of angry old women. Therefore, whatever. And that anger was somehow tied up in the popular reimagining of them during the anti-feminist backlash as like man-hating, sexless, unattractive, unreasonable.
I think you call them bonkers mad.
Right. Well, bonkers mad is great, so but like it was all made to be so unattractive. And so I knew that if I were angry in my feminism, it would I had just completely absorbed that it would drive people away. That the anger, and we are just told this, anger is divisive. It blows up relationships, right? That's what we're told all the time. And it's true. Sometimes it does, right? I'm not pretending that that's not true. It drives people away. And so I covered it up in my writing, and I was very funny, and I was cheerful and, ironic and self-deprecating. And I had just completely soaked in that admonition. And it came to me very late. In the wake of the I had begun to get more and more angry as I got older and had a little bit more power, in part. But then in the wake of the 2016 election, I was sort of paralyzed. I didn't know what my work was as a feminist journalist and as a white woman moving into a Trump administration. And I was talking to my husband during the Christmas to New Year's break of 2016, the last week of 2016, and saying, I just don't know what I'm supposed to do. And I said, I can't even think clearly because I'm so angry. Because to me, my anger was this clouding, obstructive force, and I had to get around it, but I couldn't. How can I do my work if I can't get around this fucking anger that's eating up my whole head? And it was my husband, who's not a journalist, he's like a public defender. He said very casually, probably just to have something to say back to me as I'm like, on the street. He was like, well, what if you wrote about the anger? And this suggestion that instead of just trying to get it out of my head and move around it or past it, that I could actually look directly at it. It was like just the merest suggestion that I could actually do that was allowed, that I could not only acknowledge my own anger, but take it seriously, and not just my own, but women's anger, was like my brain exploded, and I ran home and I was like, I'm gonna write this book. And that was a revolutionary suggestion to me, that I didn't have to work around it, I could just look at it. And it changed the way I saw the whole world, really. The sort of permission that I gave myself to not try to get away from the anger, but to engage it, to use it as a lens through which to look at history and contemporary politics and the way that people deal with each other and the women around me. It made the whole world look different.
So, Rebecca, is political anger at industrial or economic or legal inequalities that are experienced by women and, as you say, other disadvantaged groups, not just women, that is anger which might lead to demands for structural reform, is that the same as the anger that many women feel in their own daily lives, often towards their husbands, who don't shoulder their fair share of the domestic or the emotional labour at home? Is there like a hierarchy of female anger, like Maslow's hierarchy, with like doing the dishes at the bottom and then leading its way up to equal pay or the vote or something at the top?
Well, I think that they're related, right? So there are intimate angers that I think I'm writing in this book mostly about political anger, but there is a reason that one of the slogans for the women's movement was "The personal is political," and one of the characteristics of anger at gendered inequality is that the terms of that inequality are worked out in the most intimate of circumstances, right? So because women are an oppressed majority population, what that means is that every woman has men in her life and every man has women in his life. And what that means is that we are intimately connected to, and very often again dependent on, our oppressors. We often love them. We raise families with them. They are not just our partners and our sexual and romantic partners, they are our brothers, our fathers, our sons. And so the anger about the dishes is connected in very real ways to anger about unequally distributed political power and unequally distributed economic power. And so they often get worked out in different ways, the screaming or the throwing of a dish or the not screaming, the suppressing of the personal rage. It's also one of the reasons that it's hard to get women's movements to coalesce. Because feeling your anger at gendered inequality very often means feeling anger at people you love. And that is hard. And it's there are many explanations. We started talking about, who is asleep. One of the reasons that it is easy for women to be put to sleep for periods is because the feeling of accessing an expression of fury at gendered inequality can explode their most personal relationships. And often, once you begin to, as I described, the permission to sort of really look at, feel my anger, and see the world through this different lens, when you start looking at your world, not just the publicly political portions of it, but the personally political portions of it, it changes the way you see your life. Mm-hmm. And that is very hard. It's very hard emotional work to do, is to look around you personally and take stock, not just of the ways in which you are, subjugated or oppressed, or you do more dishes, or you do more cooking, or you do more childcare, also the ways that you're complicit, and that you participate, and that you often, and that you eagerly participate, and that you support and love men who treat other women badly. That's been one of the great complications of Me Too. And you support them as your friends or your husbands or the leaders of your political party. It's hard work to do this kind of reckoning when those relationships extend in every direction in our lives.
Okay, here's another complicated question, and I've got like 50 questions left for you, and I'm looking at the clock.
I'm sorry, I also give the longest answers.
No apologies. I think this is an apology-free zone.
I'm a compulsive apologizer.
So the uncomfortable matter, let's talk for a moment about the anger of conservative women. Because you very much make the case that using women's anger as a galvanising force can make a positive change in progressive politics. But in the US, you have had Sarah Palin and her band of patriotic Tea Party mums who were defending national family values and lower taxes and white supremacist ideas. And in Australia, we've had Pauline Hanson. We've still got Pauline Hanson.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And for the moment, we're stuck with her and her One Nation Party. And one thing that supporters say about Pauline Hanson is that she's a straight shooter. She calls out the politically correct bullshit of the major parties, and her public image is one of the pissed off, aggrieved, indignant mother lion protecting her brood of so-called ordinary Australians. So how do you reconcile these more right-wing manifestations of women's rage, particularly when they're often directed at other women?
Well, there's always going to be rewards on the table for women who are willing to do the work of the defense and support of an aggressive and abusive power structure. And I spoke earlier about the sort of way in which a majority is divided in part by the minority power offering incentives and rewards to those willing to defend it. And there's no greater reward put on the table than when the sort of most powerful, the ruling class, the white patriarchy, is always looking for members of the classes that it oppresses and subjugates to come out in its defense. And they have the power to offer. And that's really, I think, from what I know of Pauline Hanson and the way that she's talked about it and how you describe her here, and the way that I know these things are also talked about in the United States, this is one of the only forms of female anger that is sort of popularly congratulated. Sarah Palin, talked about herself as a mama grizzly and a pit bull hockey mom, and there's a kind of ferocity. You're allowed to be ferocious if your ferocity is on behalf of those who are in power and don't want that power compromised in any way. And if you're willing to do that work of being angry, not in opposition to abusive forces, but on their behalf, then there are ample rewards coming straight from those powerful people that are on the table. So yes, thus it has been, thus it shall always be. There will always be a market for those people willing to defend the structures in which they themselves are marginalized.
So a market, that's a very interesting way of putting it.
Yeah, there's tremendous incentives.
And as we know, the capitalist system rewards markets. And maybe this also leads to the last concern that I want to put before we take questions. Let's talk about men for a bit, shall we? You argue that from a very early age, male humans are culturally rewarded, and I would suggest also rewarded by capitalism, for the expression of their anger, and human females are reviled for it. But to combat domestic and other forms of violence, we are also starting to teach men to resist their anger or to channel it more productively. That's what sport's for. Are we not better diffusing anger in men rather than encouraging it in women? How important is it for mothers to raise their daughters to be angry? Is it as important for them to raise their sons to be gentle?
Yeah, I think we have to revise in both directions because, I mean, I think that we have created such an imbalance. And I don't think that in any way I'm advocating anger as an inherent virtue. I think that I'm working to correct sort of eons of messaging to women that their anger is unnatural, a perversion of nature. I'm trying to acknowledge that, in fact, that anger is just as reasonable, especially when it is in reaction to grotesque injustice, as any of the men's anger that is so visibly encouraged and rewarded. So I don't think it's sort of saying like be angry. I mean, I teach my daughters all the time, and I'm very conscious of it now. You know, I find myself saying, you don't have to yell. You know, I'm not teaching them to go out and put on boxing gloves and scream obscenities. But I do think it's about acknowledging women's anger as potent, as rational, and taking it seriously even if you want to disagree with it. In men, there is a different kind of revision that needs to take place because it has been encouraged as a sort of sign of their power, their drive, their leadership. I mean, that was never clearer to me than during those, and I don't know whether how much, if at all, you saw the Brett Kavanaugh hearings and Christine Blasey Ford, but you know, Christine Blasey Ford had all kinds of things she could rationally be angry about without banging on a table or screaming about how she likes beer. Like, she could have been angry. I mean, without having been remotely performative about it, there were 20 different angles from which she had every right to express fury about how she had been treated in the past and how she was being treated in the present. But we knew that that was not available to her as a rhetorical device. With Kavanaugh, he performed anger as a sign of his strength. Now, he looked like an asshole to most viewers, but to the people who had power, to President Donald Trump, to the men sitting on the Judiciary Committee who had the power to decide whether or not he was going to sit on the Supreme Court, that performance of fury affirmed him as righteous and correct and impassioned and believable. That was a weapon that he had, that he knew he could use, and that he must use. And so how do we begin to correct an imbalance that has gone in these two, that one of these figures who had every right to be angry couldn't so much as raise her voice a decibel? And her entire performance was one of asking, would it be all right if I had a drink? I don't want to upset you. Use it, you know. And that he had to amp it up in order to assert his power and his presence. You have to do both. You have to begin to take away the rewards that have been on offer to powerful white men especially, who have been willing to perform anger. And you have to start correcting the lack of seriousness with which women's anger has been greeted.
Let's get to the inevitable where to question. Notice how feminists are always asked this?
Yeah.
You never hear, okay, capitalism, where to next?
Right.
Yeah?
Right.
Yeah. But I do want to know, for you personally, where does Rebecca Traister go with this belly full of fire? Do you risk burnout when you live in this state of magnificent incandescence that we've all enjoyed?
Was I incandescent with anger tonight? I thought I
No,
was quite contained.
You're just magnificent. And more broadly for female collective action, where do we go?
Well, I'm in an extraordinary position, and so I'm very hesitant about drawing. I am literally paid my job is to be angry. No, I mean, I just am trying to, because I get the question about burnout a lot. And I really try to think about it honestly with regard, and people ask me, don't you get burned out? And by the way, I do. I'm here in part, I'm taking a 2-week holiday. I'm here and then I'm gonna be in Sydney next week, and I'm taking my family on holiday, because if I don't step out of my work, I mean, my brain is gonna melt because I'm so angry. And I'm in this extraordinary position of, I get taken seriously when I'm angry. I have a platform that wants to publish my anger. I have a book, you know, I get to have these conversations. I don't think for the most part that people just write me off as, you know, it's my job. And it's still, I get burnout. So the question of what is it like for people who don't have my advantages, who don't have my privileges? It is hard. And the battles don't get won quickly. And I want to go back to something I said earlier about how we're all taught that anger is divisive and pushes people away. One of the things I want to emphasize is that one of its positive powers can be, and I don't want to deny that it is divisive and destructive. Of course, it's that too. And it can eat you away, especially when it's not taken seriously, especially when you have that belly full of rage and nobody's asking you questions about it in auditoriums or on the radio. And in fact, you have a community around you that's saying, stop being so crazy, or stop being hysterical. It can eat away at you and make you feel crazy, which is something that Alicia Garza, who's one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, says to me in the book. It can make you feel like you're crazy. One of its other powers is that when anger is voiced, it can connect people. It is not just divisive. That goes back to the Women's March question. What happened when millions of people came out? They saw each other, they began to form connections and community, and one of the only ways that we're going to get through is through the networks of people who we have to support us, who are there to say, you're not crazy, I'm taking you seriously, I'm listening, I'm saying something back, you need to take a break, I'm going to spell you in whatever form of activism it is, whether it's marching and protesting, whether it's running for office, whether it's supporting somebody who's running for office, whether it's participating in a strike, whether it's telling stories and organizing around legal and civic and policy changes that will better support people who have been left out and left at the margins. Whatever that work is, it can take our entire lives, and if we don't have communities of other people around us to help us, to support us, to talk with us, to dance with us, to drink with us, to have fun with us, then we will burn out and we will suffer. And so one of the most important things that anger and its expression in any kind of public or social space where it is possible, safe, and encouraged for you to find other people who share your fury, is that it will bring you other people with whom you can work and with whom you can spend your life engaged in a fight. Because the thing is, it is hard and we get burned out, but it is also our responsibility. When we don't permit the anger at inequality and injustice to run through us, that's when we're asleep. And we can't sleep. And so the question of how do we take care of ourselves and our communities is a very real one. And I just cannot say anything more than connect. Try to find other people who are as mad as you are. Some of them may be mad at you. Listen to them too. The fury of those who want to make the world better is part of what's going to help them do the work of making the world better, I believe.
Okay, we've got some questions now. Remember, people, the best questions are questions.
Hi, I was just so I've noticed that the conversation has been quite heteronormative and wanted to know, as a queer migrant of colour, how can we incorporate the anger that people like myself feel? And I guess, does the American political landscape do that for not just for queer communities, but trans women and men and non-binary people and Indigenous communities? Because it's I guess similar in terms of Australia is not great when it comes to looking after those minorities. Yeah, so how I guess how could some of the anger that you talk about, how could that help people like me?
That's a great question. And there are a bunch of different questions embedded in it. America, the United States, is crap at recognizing a lot of the communities that you're talking about. And I want to say first, and I was thinking about it at the beginning of the night, perhaps I don't want to rank horror, but I know that the United States is absolutely reprehensibly awful at acknowledging indigenous populations and the fact that its foundation was built on the genocide of indigenous peoples. And I've noticed being here, this is the first public speaking that I've done, and you opened with acknowledgement of the land where we're speaking. I've also seen that happen and heard it happen in every public event I ever have done in Canada, and I have never heard it in the United States, ever. We don't even bother to say at the beginning of events, we don't even bother to recognize the land on which we're sitting and having conversations. So that is just the tiniest possible measure to give you an idea of how terrible the United States is on that front. Oh, no, I know, it's right, I get it, yeah. But I just want you to remember, you could be worse than crap. And I'm here to tell you that it can be worse. As far as, you're absolutely right, that the conversation tonight has been heteronormative, and your question about where does anger around queer populations fit in, it's I think deeply connected to all the other strains of anger that we're talking about. Again, it's not, in many cases it is about gendered injustice. Of course, many of the leading and angriest thinkers on gendered and racial oppression, Polly Murray in the United States was a gender non-conforming African-American woman who did so much of the intellectual work around civil rights and gendered protections that preceded really the civil rights and the women's movement, that both the Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg would go on to thank Polly Murray for sort of doing the architectural work of thinking about gendered and racial injustice in ways that didn't get recognized really in her lifetime. I also write particularly the same effect that we talked about earlier, the sort of washing out of who was angry and who were the engines behind these social movements. That happened in the United States around the gay rights movement, and the story of the Stonewall riots in particular.
Fascinating part of your book.
This is something that I write about in the book. Like the labor movement that I was taught was miners and air traffic controllers, I was always taught that the gay rights movement in the United States was a movement of white men, in many cases white middle-class men, and taught specifically about the Stonewall riot, which happened in the Greenwich Village bar in Manhattan, as being a movement of, it was white men, white gay men at that bar, right? No, it was, in many cases, gender non-conforming, female-identified women of color, who were, by many accounts, but had never really been put together in a popular narrative, were the instigators of that riot, were the ones who were absolutely furious. And that's one of the stories that I write about. But again, the women of color and the gender nonconforming women who were leaders within that movement and who were the instigators and throwing the first rock, those are stories we're not told. When there was a popular movie called Stonewall a few years ago, it was about like a white cis man from the Midwest. And so these stories are absolutely intertwined with some of the other stories that we've mentioned here tonight. The question of how we interrogate progressive movements, women's movements, to make sure that gender nonconforming, trans, indigenous women are fully not only represented but acknowledged as being the leaders that in fact they have always been. That is a question and a battle that remains open, and part of why I say that it's the anger between allies is just as fruitful, and this is something that Audre Lorde was writing about in the 80s, that the frustrations within progressive movements and within progressive coalitions about who is still denied power and voice within them and recognition of their leadership. This is a question that I think, this is a discussion that I think your question gets to.
Okay, let's take one from over here.
Hi. Long-time fan, first time asking you a question, I guess. I guess I have a question, about like conservative women, because especially in Australia recently, we've had all these women from our Conservative Party kind of come out and be like, as soon as the party's kind of not like working especially for them, they're being like, we're being horribly bullied, like it's a terrible place, which like, I'm kind of like, obviously.
Right,
Like
yeah.
the like policies you've stood with them by have been
Yes.
like terrible for us. And I guess in like the US, like Megyn Kelly, I guess is kind of an example, right? Where like as soon as it stopped working for her, she was kind of like, yeah, like this feminine things might not be so bad. And I guess like how do we like reconcile that with trying to like, I guess make feminism inclusive, but like also understanding that like they stood by and like watched us kind of have these horrible policies. And like especially, I guess the deputy leader, Julie Bishop, she was like got all this recognition recently with like wearing red high heels, but like stood by like her leader who said like abortion was the easy way out of an awkward situation and like just supported him. And so, yeah, I guess that's, if that's a question, I definitely try to make that a question.
Well, I think how do we address this is exactly as you're doing, which is acknowledging it, right? The fight for greater freedom, liberty, autonomy, for more rights, I fight for that for everybody. I fight for that for Sarah Palin. I want Sarah Palin and Kellyanne Conway to have, that's I think part of the progressive mission is you're not just fighting for those who agree with you. You're fighting for the expansions of liberty and equality for those who don't agree with you as well. And I think that it is simultaneously possible, and we have a lot of that. There are lots of conservative women who are very eager to use the language of feminism when it suits them, In fact, when they're being criticized. This is something Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who's the spokesperson for Donald Trump, has on a couple of occasions done this. Well, I don't think they'd say this about trying to, because they see the language of feminism as an attractive, like as a kind of, the way they cast it is the language of victimhood. They want to use it to be victims themselves. By the way, sometimes they are victims, right? And so the trick for those of us who are writing about it and talking about it is to be able to be nuanced and understand that we can simultaneously acknowledge that, yes, these women working on behalf of conservative policies, making conditions for other women worse, can also experience sexism, can also be harassed and assaulted, can also be paid less for their work. And when they complain about it, we can say, yes, that's right. And the party or the policies that you support make those conditions worse for you and for millions of other people who don't have your advantages. And so I think that the trick, there's not one easy answer to that. It's about just insisting on having a nuanced conversation. And that is something, and it is a real failure in the United States. You mentioned Megyn Kelly, and she's one of the people who came forward and talked about Roger Ailes and his harassment. And there's such a desire to make stories simple and neat and one-dimensional. So I do worry that there's an impulse that, to some extent, what Megyn Kelly did, that not just to some extent, is brave to come out and tell a story like that. But that doesn't mean it's the end of the story for her and on our estimation of her. It is possible to say Megyn Kelly did an unusual and brave thing in wielding the power that she had within her network and the power that she had with an American public to tell a story of harassment that would be very compelling to people who might otherwise not listen to it if it was coming not from inside the Fox building, right? But we can tell that story and acknowledge that dynamic without making her into a feminist heroine and forgetting that in her work for the Fox network, she elevated not just Donald Trump, but the party that made Donald Trump and the party that had been, working toward enacting the policies that he says out loud for decades, and that she fueled that. And we can say both of those things. We don't just have to say, like, yes, girl, Megyn Kelly. We can say, we are smart enough to hold multiple thoughts in our heads at the same time and don't let people turn these individuals into simple stories, Because the stories aren't simple. They're nuanced, and it's our job to insist on that nuance and not let everything get turned into a t-shirt.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up. So, you already have, but please join me in thanking Rebecca Traister for her intellect and her humour and her candour and her beautiful rage here tonight.
Thank you so much.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.